I've been experimenting with different pressure switches, trying to get my well system in my house dialed in right where I want it. I've noticed that 20 psi split for my situation is really not ideal. Basically what I end up with is I really kind of want to have my pressure in the 50 range. 55 psi seems to be a good point for a cutoff, but that would mean I'd have to be down to 35 psi on my cut in, and just a little lower than I prefer, especially for my reverse osmosis system. At the time that I had hooked up, I read, RO systems work a lot better with higher pressure, and this thing seems to spend more time in the 30s than it does in the 50s when you're set up for 35, 55. So apparently some of these pressure switches there's quite a lot of difference between them. This is an example of a pressure switch that's a 20 psi split, meaning it could be a 20-40 or a 30-50, and it's based on this main spring here. If you tighten this screw down, you're going to increase your cut in and cut out pressure, and if you tighten this screw behind it down, you'll increase your cut out pressure, and that just means that you can increase it to a 25 psi split, so you might end up with a 30-55 or something like that. This type of pressure switch has two separate screws, and this is your main one for cut in and cut out. If you tighten it down, it'll increase your cut in and cut out. But if this one comes set from the factory already tightened down, and this adjusts your cut out pressure. So what that means is that if you back this thing off, you can turn this into a 15 psi split, meaning you could do like a 40-55. So that way you're not going to be going all the way up to, you can still have your cut in at 40, which is decent. You're going to have decent pressure at 40 psi. But your cutout doesn't have to be all the way up to 60, because I've noticed that my pump has a hard time getting up to 60. I've also noticed that my water pressure coming out of the faucet, maybe at 60, I actually think might be a little too high. People complain about splashing in certain kinds of sinks, and I have noticed that if I grab the handle and open it up, it's just a lot more force than I really need to come out of that thing. And so I actually prefer the 15 psi split, and you have to have this style of pressure switch to get that. This is another style pressure switch that doesn't have any adjustment screw for the cut out pressure. It's only for cut in and cut out on this main screw here. So I adjusted both of my tanks to both of my systems to 40/55, and I've been pretty happy with that. And I had to actually install this type of switch on my tank and take this one off in order to achieve that. Something else you might want to keep in mind is that if you adjust your pressure on your pressure switch, you have to make sure to adjust the air pressure in the air side of your pressure tank. So it's in relation to your cut in pressure. So if you change your cut in pressure, you need to adjust your air pressure in the same direction. So let's say you change from a 20-40 to a 40-55. So now you have to change your air pressure in your tank from about 18 psi to about 38 psi. Although I would recommend don't pay so much attention to the actual psi on your air side pressure gauge. Pay more attention to when the tank bladder collapses relative to when your switch kicks on. So let's say you want to test this. Wait till your system is set up where you have just a little bit of water in the system. Unplug your pump and then open up your drain and watch your pressure gauge. As your pressure gauge continues to drop, at some point in time it'll collapse, meaning it'll all of a sudden go from, say, 39 to 0. That's how you know what the air pressure in your tank really is. So as that pressure gauge is falling, you're going to hear a click, which is the pressure switch turning on. If that click happens after and during the collapse of the bladder, that means you need to increase your air pressure. If that click happens just before the bladder collapses, that's perfect. If that click happens way before the bladder collapses, you need to take some air out of the system, because what that means is that there's going to be a lot of water still in the tank that's not getting pushed out by the air pressure, and your pump's going to kick back on long before. So you're going to actually lose some tank capacity by having your air pressure too high. So and of course, if your air pressure is too low, you're going to have a sudden drop in pressure every single time, and on top of that, every time your system before it kicks on, and on top of that, you're going to be stirring up sediment potentially in the tank and causing some murky water to come out. You really don't want that bladder to collapse on a regular basis. The only time you'd ever want it to collapse is when you're trying to flush out sediment and clean that system up. So something to keep in mind, if you do adjust your pressure switch, you want to keep an eye on that air pressure on your tanks.